Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabrielle, and these are my groupmates, Shaun and Risa. The issue we're talking about today is the lack of social integration between Singaporeans and migrant workers. So I'll be telling us why this issue is important. Shaun will then talk about the consequences, and Risa will end off this time by sharing some solutions. So before we begin, I'm sure many of you must be wondering, why should we care about this issue? How does it concern us? Well, one big reason is because migrant workers contribute to a significant population of the people currently staying in Singapore. And as you can see from this pie chart, they actually make up more than 20% of everyone else that's staying in Singapore. So to create a basis of comparison, migrant workers actually contribute to a greater percentage of residents living here than ethnic Malays in Singapore, which only make up 15%. So on top of this, migrant workers are also the ones building our homes. They are also the ones providing crucial infrastructure, which is essential for the running of society. So, as Singaporeans, we should view migrant workers with gratitude, and we should also accord them due dignity and respect that they deserve. However, this is unfortunately not the case. In many instances, Singaporeans verbally assault migrant workers, mistreat migrant workers, and they're also being bullied by some of us. So, what are the reasons contributing to this issue? Well, we have 3 reasons. Firstly, it is because there's a lack of awareness among Singaporeans about migrant workers. Secondly, our misconceptions of migrant workers may create unnecessary fear, which prevents social interaction from taking place. Finally, geographical segregation between us and migrant workers creates social divides between us and them. So before we continue, I'd like to just bring us through 2 simple questions to show us how aware we are of everyday lives of migrant workers. So if you all would participate, I would like us all to first close our eyes. And even as you close your eyes, I want you to picture, how do you think the living conditions of migrant workers are like? Alright, you may now open your eyes. And as you can see from the screen, it's actually very cluttered, and many men share a single room. Okay, next, I'll invite all of us to close our eyes again. And this time, I'd like you to picture, what does a typical lunch for migrant workers look like? Got a picture? Alright, you can open your eyes now. As you see, they are given lots of rice, a splash of gravy on the side, and a tiny mozzarella of fish. So, could I just get a show of hands to see how many of you pictured anything remotely similar to this just now? No? Oh, great, thank you. Thank you everyone for your participation. The aim of this activity is to show us how aware we are of the everyday realities of these migrant workers. Moving on to my second point, misconceptions. So, many of us often perceive migrant workers to be potential criminals who are more likely to commit crimes such as rape, murder, and theft. However, this is not actually the case. In fact, these ideas that we have on migrant workers only serve to create unnecessary fears and create feelings of animosity towards them. So these misconceptions instead actually stems from our ignorance toward migrant workers. Therefore, there's a greater need for all of us to show them greater empathy and to better understand them. Moving on to my final point, geographical segregation. So geographical segregation actually exists because migrant workers are housed in far proximity from the rest of Singaporeans. So as you can see from the slide, they're clustered in areas like Woodlands and Jurong. And for Singaporeans who are not living around these areas, these workers are usually out of sight and out of mind. Now I'll pass the time over to my next presenter, Shaun.
Alright, thank you, Gabrielle. Now allow me to introduce you to the life of a migrant worker. So why are these migrant workers here in Singapore? So many of these migrant workers actually do have degrees back home. However, they are unable to find jobs due to an oversaturation in demand. At the same time, the pay in Singapore as a migrant worker is a lot higher, and this allows them to support their families back home. Allow me to put things into perspective. Being a construction worker here in Singapore only allows them to earn up to $60 a day, and that is still a really meager amount. Living conditions, as mentioned by Gabrielle earlier, a lot of these migrant workers live in dormitories. However, the conditions are less than ideal. Firstly, because they're overcrowded, and this poses as a safety and fire hazard. Secondly, it's unhygienic. This is an example of a washing basin where migrant workers do their laundry. Third, it's unsanitary. On the walls is actually the blood of bed bugs smeared across the wall by these migrant workers because these pests disrupt their sleep. And lastly, the lack of personal space, shown by the example of this washroom in the typical dorm. So, their food situation, and explained by Gabrielle earlier, based on the picture you saw, the food tends to be unappetizing and lacks the proper nutritional value. These migrant workers are working in labor-intensive jobs, and they require so much more nutrition than just that bit of fish. Secondly, the food tends to be pre-cooked and packed the night before. It's only around 10 to 12 hours later before these migrant workers actually consume them for breakfast and lunch. Next, food tends to be unhygienic, as you can see from this photo here. The food stock tends to be placed next to unsanitary items like a shoe rack, and this causes the food to be contaminated. And this increases the risk of infections and food poisoning. Next, more real-life examples of migrant workers was exemplified when Channels News Asia actually went down to these dormitories to interview and record down what it's like for these migrant workers to go about their daily lives. So despite it being Ramadan, where they will have to fast, their workload remained the same. Despite having to stay up late to cook and waking up as early as 4 a.m., to actually consume their meals before they observe their fast, these migrant workers tried their best to keep a positive attitude and helped one another remain safe throughout their workplace. And it's only through the team spirit and camaraderie were they able to rely on one another and survive the day, survive the fast, basically. Another real-life example is Muhammad Sharif. So he's actually a construction worker who wrote a memoir titled A Stranger to Myself. In 2015, he wrote a poem, A Death of Dreams. This poem talks about how working as a migrant worker here in Singapore was not how he envisioned it to be. In his book, he shared his 10 years of working experience as a migrant worker, secondly, the problems he faced, and lastly, how much he struggled with loneliness. And the thing to take note about him is that even though he wrote this memoir, he did not mean any ill intent or harm towards Singaporeans. He was basically just sharing his story. Now that you know a bit more about these migrant workers, allow me to share with you about the consequences that arise from the lack of social interaction that we have with them. Firstly, these migrant workers are not well integrated into our society. We Singaporeans tend to pit ourselves against these migrant workers, and this causes tensions to arise. Issues like discrimination starts to appear and is manifested through our actions. Examples include, in Little India after the riots, ring fencing occurred, where these migrant workers are not allowed to congregate in large areas. Secondly, shopping malls like Wisma Asia actually ban construction workers from using their washrooms. And because they're not well integrated into our society, it contributes to their already poor mental well-being. So a SMU study research has shown that these migrant workers already are affected in terms of well-being because of the precarious nature of their work. The top 3 causes include, number 1, threats by employers of being deported back home. Number 2, debts owed to agents. And lastly, the lack of housing. Imagine already being stressed out by all these things, and to top it all off with being maligned by Singaporeans, the people they're actually working for. It's definitely bad for their well-being. So allow me to now pass the time over to Risa.
Thank you, Shaun. While I was researching on this issue, I found out that that Singaporeans who are interested in reaching out to migrant workers hardly do so. You might wonder, why is that the case? Well, it's because most of them don't even know where to begin. So let me introduce 3 things anyone can do to make that first step. Firstly, you can host a meal at your house. In relation to Shaun and Gabby's points about the food servings, this is a good opportunity for you to let the migrant workers try a good local meal. Also, the house setting helps both parties not to feel so intimidated by each other. By interacting with them at the comfort of your own home, this debunks the misconception that migrant workers are dangerous. One such example is this Come Makan With Me initiative. It started in November 2017 by Mr. Fahid, a regular volunteer at Migrant Workers Center. Through this initiative, he encourages homeowners to invite foreign workers for a meal at their house. And from past sessions, it has been positively received. For the migrant workers, we were very surprised but touched by the invitation, and we're really happy to get to know the Singaporean families. Likewise, the Singaporean families were happy to get to know them too. Secondly, we can celebrate special occasions together, like Chinese New Year, Ramadan, or Diwali. As Singapore is a multicultural and multiracial society, we need to embrace the diversity of migrant workers coming to work here. One such example is this Ramadan home visit. So while Shaun talked about part 1 of the video, I'll be talking about part 2. So what happened in part 2 is that some of the families who watched part 1 were really inspired by the amount of strength that these migrant workers showed during the tough Ramadan period. So they decided to open up their houses so that they can all celebrate Ramadan together. And what struck me the most about this video was that it was the first time for these migrant workers to step into the HDB, even though they were the ones who built it. Also, this eases homesickness, especially for these migrant workers who have financial or employment constraints that hinder them from going back home to celebrate this special occasion. Lastly, and most importantly, is to use your voice. Your voice really matters. For example, Come Makan With Me started from one person's voice. So talk about this issue with your family and with your friends. It's really not hard to do. So one example is this recent engagement done by CAP, a residential college in NUS. So what happened is, Westlife Dormitory partnered up with St. Luke's Hospital to paint up the walls. Then, CAP students came to experience the event with them, and later shared their reflections within CAP and also on an NUS article. I'd like to highlight this quote from our senior who took part in this engagement. The visit helped me see them beyond the label of migrant workers. In order to build social integration between migrant workers and Singaporeans, we need to first see them as equals. Like what Natalie said, migrant workers are not just defined by their jobs, they're defined by their own unique stories too. Today, Gabby, Shaun and I are here to talk about an issue that is really close to our heart. So we hope that we opened a new perspective on migrant workers. And we believe that social integration between migrant workers and Singaporeans can definitely be improved. It all starts with what all of you can do. Also, if you'd like to find out more about our presentation, check out our references. Okay, thank you.